those shows. So I didn't know much about Fred Rogers, except the little snippets I'd see on TV, and I thought, wow, that show doesn't look all that great. And then several months ago, one of our members here recommended that I watch a PBS special on Mr. Rogers called Mr. Rogers and Me, I believe. And as I was watching that, I thought, wow, I've really missed something here. This is an incredible man. And while I was watching that show, they did an interview with a guy who was a friend of Mr. Rogers. And he had written a book about his relationship called I'm Proud of You, My Friendship with Fred Rogers. And I read the book and was deeply moved by it because there were so many really important life lessons in that book. And so I wrote Tim Madigan an email back in April, and I said, just read your book. I don't know if you ever do this, but would you be willing to come to our church and tell your story of how Mr. Rogers impacted your life? And he wrote me back, and he said, I know you. And I didn't know him, but he knew me. And some of his family have been attached to this church from time to time, and I've done some funerals for some of his family members, and that's how we sort of got to know each other. And he said, yes, I'd be delighted to come. And so yesterday he spoke to our men's group at 6:30 in the morning, and we had a wonderful time, and he was here last night. And tomorrow night at 6:30, he's going to be back here with us and spend about an hour or so just telling some of his stories of his experiences with Mr. Rogers and what Fred Rogers was like. And we want to give you a little preview of that today and to hear some of the stories that I think are really pertinent to those of us who are followers of Jesus, because Fred was a man who spoke words of Jesus all the time. And so would you please welcome Tim Madigan as he comes to share a story with us today. There you go, my friend. It's good to have you. Well, Tim, thank you for being here. Tim is from Fort Worth, Dallas area. Kind of a Cowboys fan, but we're letting him in anyway. And I grew up a Vikings fan. We really hate the Dallas Cowboys. Yeah.
I hated the Cowboys.
Yeah, it's right. He's got it. There we go.
I hated the Cowboys.
Okay, did I not turn it on? There it is. Try it again. Okay.
God didn't want me to say that I hated the Cowboys. But I grew up in Minnesota.
Yeah, right.
And I was a Vikings fan, and then I moved to Texas and went over to the dark side.
Yeah, you sure did.
And well, enough said about that.
Yeah.
I'm getting myself in.
That's all right. So tell us, just give us a little bit of the background of how you got to meet Fred Rogers and begin this friendship.
I was, for 30 years, I was a writer at the Fort Worth Star-Telegram newspaper, and I eventually got down here from the Midwest. And I was writing a story about violence on television and how it affected children. And a colleague of mine at the paper said, you should interview for that story. You should interview Captain Kangaroo and Mr. Rogers. So I did. I managed to make arrangements to talk to them. And so I wrote that piece about violence on television, and then I was invited to Pittsburgh to spend 4 days with Fred to write a profile on Fred himself. And for reasons that continue to mystify me, or maybe it's not so mysterious, because Fred was the kind of person who, and it drove the people around him nuts, but the ones who were kind of responsible for kind of keeping him on schedule, he would extend himself in genuine friendship to anyone he met in the most sincere and the most profound and most authentic way. And so he did that with me. And so this was in the fall of 1995, and from that time on until he died in 2003, strange as it would seem, he became one of my closest friends.
What was it, and this isn't a knock on Captain Kangaroo, because he was just a brilliant mind as well, but what was it about Fred that was different than Captain Kangaroo that built the friendship?
Well, Bob Keesh and Captain Kangaroo is a great guy, and based on my 20 minutes speaking with him. And a little known fact is that Captain Kangaroo and Mr. Rogers made a point of speaking every New Year's Day
To each other.
to each other.
Huh.
But I had this long conversation. That first conversation with Fred he's very generous with his time. And he talked about how heartbroken he was at the state of children's television and how he considered his program to try to be kind of a pushback against that. Anyway, late in the conversation, and I don't really remember the context, he said to me, Tim, do you know what the most important thing in my life is right now? And I said, well, Mr. Rogers, we just met. How could I possibly know that? And he said, speaking with Mr. Tim Madigan on the telephone. And there's something about the way he said it where I knew he was being absolutely genuine. It wasn't his job, it wasn't his family, it wasn't other friends, it was me. And the reason for that was I just happened to be the person in his human space at that moment. And you asked the question last night if there's one word that would kind of encapsulate who he was, and the word is presence, is that he had this almost supernatural capacity to be present to life without any of his own agenda, any of his own preoccupations, that when he was with you, he was completely with you, completely empty of himself, and would take in whatever you wanted to share, and then respond from this place, this pure place of spirit, with compassion, love, wisdom, and to me, probably most importantly, never judgment.
I've read a couple different books now by people who were friends with Mr. Rogers, and the one thing that stands out for me is you get the sense that the author is the only friend Mr. Rogers had. It was that sort of presence, and the books were almost identical in terms of tone. With yours and then Amy's book, The Simple Faith of Mr. Rogers, which speaks volumes about who he was. You may or may not know this, but he was a Presbyterian minister. And his church, he was officially called, his church was his TV studio, his audience was children, and the Presbyterian church saw that as their ministry through him. And so it is remarkable to think through all the different ways that he spoke Jesus to people without people necessarily knowing what he was actually up to, but he was spreading the word, even Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, about all of our neighbors as a Jesus concept. And I want to look today, well, again, he's going to get into more stories tomorrow, but there are two letters in particular in your book that stood out for me, where Mr. Rogers was Jesus to you. And the first was really kind of the title of your book. You when you first met Mr. Rogers, you're doing really well in your public life, your work life, not so well in your private life, and that prompted a letter to Mr. Rogers based on a deep wound that you had that wasn't being filled by your dad.
Yeah, there was a risk, a happy risk, to be a friend with someone like him, because he didn't want to talk about the Steelers. He didn't watch television. He thought television was crap, frankly. Yeah. His wife, on the other hand, consumed a lot of television, but he wanted to know who you really were. And on the wall of his office in Pittsburgh, there was a phrase from the book The Little Prince: "What is essential is invisible to the eye." And so he wanted to know about what he called your essential invisibles, what it was about the neighbor that didn't meet the eye. And invariably, those things are going to be painful. So he would say, anything mentionable is manageable. He always spoke in these kind of unequivocal terms. Yeah. Anything mentionable is manageable. He didn't say most things, anything. So at the end of 6 months of relatively superficial correspondence,
And by the way, you're writing letters.
Yeah, I wrote him several letters.
And you might explain just for some what a letter is.
That is something where you get a piece of paper, and you scribble something, and then you put it in a envelope.
handwrite it.
Handwrite it, put it in an envelope, lick a stamp, and mail it away.
Wow. Wow. Those were the days.
And then the Pony Express comes and picks it up and takes it to it. So anyway, I wrote him a letter in late June of 1996 that said, "Dear Fred, I'm really glad that we're friends, but if we're going to be friends, I think you'd be the first to agree that you need to know the truth of my life." So here it is. And I told him about this terrible, life-threatening depression that I had been suffering from for years, and horrible self-esteem issues and struggles in my marriage. And as you referenced, my career, I was winning all kinds of journalism awards, and if you were to look at me from a distance, you'd think this guy has it all going on, and on the inside, I was dying. And so I told Fred that, and I said, "Fred, the heart of all this seems to be this haunting sense that all of my life I've been trying to get my father to be proud of me. I try to be a good student and athlete and win journalism awards and all this stuff, and for whatever reason, it's never felt to me that I've succeeded." So I said in this letter, "I have a question to ask you, Fred. Would you be proud of me?" And I folded it up and put it in a stamp and licked it. Pony Express took it away. July 1st, 1996, I had his reply, which said, "Dear Tim, yes, exclamation points, yes. I am proud of you. I will be proud of you. I have been proud of you since first we met." But the most remarkable things that he said were what came next, I think. He said, "I'm deeply touched that you would care to share so much of yourself with me, and look forward to hearing all that you would care to share in the future." And I don't think he ever said a word he didn't mean. But at another time he told me, "Your trust confirms my trustworthiness." And I think that, and in my opinion, is that when we can share our true selves with another person, even the most painful and shameful stuff, that we are giving that person one of the highest compliments one human can give to another, which is to say, "I trust you." So anyway, he said, "Nothing you could," in this letter, he said, "Nothing you could tell me," again, an unequivocal word, "nothing you could tell me could change my yes for you. Please remember that. Your place in this life is unique, absolutely unique. Do you know how special you really are? Only God can arrange such mutually trusting friendships. Yes, Tim, yes. Love, Fred." And then for the rest of our correspondence over the remaining years and hundreds of emails and letters that went back and forth, he almost always signed off, IPOY.
What did that do for you when you read those words, "Yes, I'm proud of you"? Did you sense something? Did you feel something? Or did it grow? Did you grow into it?
The Hollywood version is that it would change my life, and I rode off into the sunset. But we don't live in the Hollywood version, But that was what that was the beginning of that relationship, or it was a definite shift in that relationship.
Yeah.
And the other part of it is that it's really important. So important to remember is Fred wasn't the only person in my life with whom I could do that with.
Right.
And I think that it would behoove us to kind of take inventory of in our own lives and to identify the Mr. Rogers type people in our own lives who not only want to know, who we really are in all of our tattered humanity, and won't judge us, and will be present to it. And so that I think is a larger message. I mean, Fred was doing for me what we can all do for one another. Mm-hmm. And so over time, I mean, and so this was, that was a big moment in my process in healing, but that process in healing and growing as a human being continues to this day.
Yep.
There are things, you know, in the relationship you and I have formed this weekend, in the conversations that I've had with people who I've met and interacted with, have been so nourishing and healing to me. Mm. It's not like Fred Rogers says, "I'm proud of you," and we ride off in the sunset. It's like we keep walking the road only knowing that we're not walking alone.
Yeah.
That we're not walking alone.
Yeah. So a little later on then, you revealed some more of yourself to him, and it really taken a pretty big risk to say, this is where my life really is at. Can you still be proud of me? So talk about that second letter.
Well, that was a year and a half later, and again, he had said in that first letter that nothing I could do could change my yes for you, as he put it. Well, a year and a half later, I thought I'd finally found it, because the book begins with me putting up Christmas lights at our home in Texas in holiday season of 1997, I guess it was. And doing so with a very frightened and heavy heart, because a few days before, I told my wife that I wanted a separation. So as I'm putting up these lights, I'm thinking to myself, you know, how are we going to tell the kids? You know, can we make it through the holidays? How are we going to tell our families? Where am I going to find an apartment, etc.? But quite literally, the thing that I worried about most that day was, how in the world am I going to tell Fred Rogers that I'm getting ready to leave my wife? You know, this person who had spent his life and career working for families and children, and I'm getting ready to blow up my own. Well, after the lights were done, I summoned the courage and went into my den and sat down and started typing on my computer this letter that said, "Dear Fred, I really hate to have to tell you this, but this is what's going on." And I asked him, I said, "Could you be proud of a man like that?" A few days later, I had his reply in another letter that said, "Dear Tim, please know that I would never forsake you. That I would never stop loving you. That I will always be proud of you. If only we lived closer, I would drive to your house and knock on your door, and when you answered, I would take you into my arms and hug you tight." He said, "The kingdom of God is for the brokenhearted." He said, "I'm more convinced than ever that fewer and fewer people in this life can escape major suffering." And then he signed off by saying, "You are my beloved brother, Tim. You are God's beloved son. And this at the moment of my greatest shame."
And then you wrote a follow-up later.
I wrote another letter a couple of weeks later, which said, "Catherine and I are not going to separate." I had gone away to do some soul searching and realized that the problem wasn't her. And so I sent that to him, and he writes back. And what do you think he said? "Oh, thank God." He said, "You and Catherine have been through so much together and continue to grow in such important ways. So happy for you and your children." And then he said, "Do you know how important it is to have such a trusting and trustworthy friend?" The point being, of course, that he didn't want us to get divorced. But at the time that he received that letter from me with my sad news, The only thing that mattered to him was that I was in pain. A guy doesn't do what I was about to do without being in a lot of pain. And that is all that mattered. He didn't try to problem solve. He didn't try to do anything other than to say, please know that I would never forsake you. And I think that's in the Bible someplace.
Mm-hmm. What's so amazing to me in these letters, and there'll be more stories tomorrow, is he's just speaking Jesus' words to you and had the humility and the courage and the passion to just speak grace words. And it revolutionized so many people's lives because people crave grace so deeply.
You know, that's another thing I've been thinking about this weekend, and particularly with what you just said, the courage that it takes to do that.
Yeah.
The courage that it takes to speak grace. The courage that it takes to speak love. Mm-hmm. Especially for men. Yeah. I think, you know, when they had this remarkable experience with your guys at Bible study, and you know, it's kind of counter to who we're thought we should be in the world. That it's too often we seem cut out from that. But just to say, I'm here. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to judge you. I'm going to support you. I'm going to walk with you. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to love you unconditionally. Yep. And it takes so much courage. Yep. But the risk, there's no words to say. People will say, is it hard for you to talk about this stuff? Well, maybe initially it was. But now it's the greatest blessing of my life to share this message, because I'm absorbing. You take off your mask and you share who you really are, and you are rewarded with all the love and presence that I feel in this room at this moment.
Yeah. Tim, thank you. Would you thank Tim Madigan? Thank you, my friend.